For 40 years, a man named Edward Callahan lived so far off the map that most folks in Wyoming forgot he even existed. Up in the high country, tucked between weather-beaten pines and silence thick enough to swallow a man whole, he built a life no one ever bothered to ask about. The town of Pine Ridge called him a ghost, a rumor, a hermit with secrets carved deep into him. But every morning at exactly 5:15 a.m., something unbelievable happened. A wild paint stallion emerged from the mountain ridge, walked the same narrow path through snow, rain, and blistering heat, and stopped at the same fence post, waiting for Edward. Not once a week, not when the weather behaved every single morning, for 40 years. What could bind a broken man and a wild creature with such relentless devotion? What happened in the mountains that turned silence into a ritual no storm could break? And why did this bond, hidden from the world for 4 decades, become the one thing that kept both of them alive? This is not just a Wild West tale. This is a story about loyalty the world didn't believe was possible. A story so powerful, it didn't end even after one of them was gone. If you're already feeling that pull in your chest, the kind you get when you know a story is about to take you somewhere deep, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and share. It helps our small Western storytelling community grow, and it ensures you won't miss the next tale we bring to the campfire here on WesTtalesas A Down. Pine Ridge, Wyoming, was the kind of place where the wind seemed to carry every secret. Yet somehow one man managed to hold on to his without ever letting it spill. Folks talked about Edward Callahan the way Western towns talk about ghosts, soft enough to show respect, but curious enough to keep the legend alive. He wasn't a violent outlaw or a gold rush drifter. He was something stranger. A man who walked into Pine Ridge 40 years earlier, bought a stretch of remote mountain land, built a cabin out of his own sweat and stubbornness, and then simply disappeared from human life. The general store cashier, an old-timer named Ward, used to tell tourists he's been up there since '84, doesn't talk to people. Talks to the mountains, talks to horses, if the rumors are true. Most visitors would chuckle, assuming it was just local flavor, part of the charm small Western towns use to sell postcards and coffee mugs. But Ward wasn't joking. Edward had become part of the landscape, as expected and unchanging as the ridgeline itself. Residents stopped wondering why he stayed, stopped trying to understand him. The man wanted solitude. End of story. Or so they thought. Every morning, before Pine Ridge had even rubbed the sleep from its eyes, Edward woke at 4:30 a.m. The mountains were still holding on to the last threads of darkness. The air was sharp, cold enough to sting the lungs. Yet Edward never missed his ritual. He put on the same worn-down coat, grabbed the same old walking stick hand-carved, polished smooth by decades of use, and stepped outside. His boots crunched over frost-hardened dirt as he walked a narrow path to the northeast fence line. To anyone else, the fence looked like nothing. Just a stretch of wire cutting through pines and sagebrush, a place no one would bother noticing. But for Edward, it was the beating heart of his existence, the anchor that held his days together. At exactly 5:15 a.m., he would reach the same fence post, lean on it for support, and wait. He never looked impatient, never restless, never distracted. He simply stood there as if standing was his purpose. And then, from the high country, the sound would come, hoof beats slow, steady, unmistakable. A rhythm carried by a creature that had memorized this trail long before the sun even thought of rising. A wild paint stallion, a creature who didn't belong to any rancher, any roundup, any human hand. White and chestnut patches like spilled paint across a body built for the mountains. Sharp eyes, unbroken spirit, a leader among the wild bands that roamed the Wyoming backcountry. And he came alone. Every single morning, the stallion would descend from the ridge with a purpose that didn't resemble instinct. Wild horses migrate with the seasons, move with their herds, follow survival patterns passed down generations. They don't follow the same exact path at the same exact hour, day after day, year after year. They don't risk storms, predators, injury, and hunger to meet a human. Yet this one did. Edward called him Promise. The name wasn't chosen lightly. It carried history, weight, and a memory only Edward knew. People assumed he'd gone mad from isolation, that the long winters had turned his mind inward. But anyone who ever happened upon the mountains in those early hours, which was almost nobody, would have seen something too consistent, too deliberate, too steady to be dismissed as delusion. Promise always arrived. Edward always waited. The ritual never changed. For a few minutes, the two of them existed in a quiet conversation that didn't require human words. Edward would offer an apple, or half a carrot, or whatever he could spare. Promise would take it gently, as if understanding the exchange mattered more than the food itself. Edward would talk in a low voice, telling the Stallion things he never told another soul. The man didn't have anyone else to confide in. 40 years of isolation can break a person's tongue, make them forget what sharing sounds like. But not with Promise. With Promise, he spoke freely. About the winters that frightened him, about the summers that healed him, about the ghosts he carried but could never outrun. And the Stallion, wild, unbroken, untamed, stood still and listened. Animals don't choose people without reason, and Promise's reason ran deeper than instinct. The mountains around Edward's cabin were harsh, wild, unforgiving. Snowstorms could bury a road in minutes. Winds could snap branches like twigs. Nights stretched long and mercilessly dark. Yet through every blizzard, through every stretch of drought, through the injuries and age that crept into both man and horse, the morning ritual held firm. If Edward was late, Promise waited. If Promise was slowed by injury, Edward stayed at the fence until he appeared. If snow piled high, both carved paths through it to meet in the middle. Nothing, absolutely nothing, ever interrupted their strange, steadfast bond. But the rest of the world, it knew nothing. The people of Pine Ridge only saw Edward when he came into town once every few months for supplies. He never lingered, never chatted, never made friends. Word was he slept in the woods if he had to pick up mail. In a town of 247 residents, where everyone noticed everything, the mystery surrounding him only grew. Some said he was hiding from the law. Some said he'd lost his family in a tragic accident. Others said he'd simply gone crazy. None of them knew how close they were to the truth without touching it. Edward wasn't hiding from the law, but he was hiding from the world. He wasn't crazy, but he carried guilt heavy enough to crush a lesser man. And he hadn't lost his family to a random tragedy. He lost them to something that carved a scar so deep it kept him from ever returning to civilization. And Promise, he wasn't just a horse who wandered by. He was the only creature on Earth who had been there on the very night Edward decided not to die. But Pine Ridge didn't know that, not yet. For them, it was just a hermit and a rumor of a horse. A quiet mountain man and a mystery that seemed too strange to investigate. Still, in the early mornings, while the town slept, two silhouettes met at a lonely fence line: the broken man who chose punishment through isolation, and the wild Stallion who refused to let him vanish completely. The mountains knew their story long before anyone else did. And if anyone had followed that ridge path just once, they would have seen the truth, a bond so improbable, so stubbornly faithful, it defied everything people believed about man and beast. But the real reason behind that loyalty, why Promise chose Edward, and why Edward clung to that ritual with the discipline of a dying soldier, was buried deep in the past. A past Edward had never shared, a past that still bled through the silence. And that past was about to come to light.
Before Edward Callahan became the hermit of Pine Ridge, before his life shrank down to 20 acres of mountain solitude and a silent ritual at dawn, he had been a man with a future, a man with a family, a man whose world once looked ordinary, predictable, and stable. But the trouble with ordinary lives is that the cracks often spread quietly, long before anyone notices a collapse coming. And for Edward, the collapse didn't come in a single moment. It came drip by drip, drink by drink, one small surrender at a time. In 1982, Edward lived in Denver, working as a structural engineer, a profession that suited him. He was methodical, careful, a man who found comfort in blueprints and certainties, in measurements that behaved, in steel beams that only bent when the math allowed it. At home, he had Claire, the woman who steadied him, and Lily, their bright-eyed 8-year-old who believed her father could build anything, fix anything, survive anything. The three of them lived in a modest suburban house, the kind with neatly trimmed lawns and neighbors who waved without knowing much about each other. To the outside world, they were the kind of family people described as doing well. But inside their walls, cracks were growing. Edward had always liked to unwind with a drink after work. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, until slowly, subtly, that one drink turned into two into four into bottles hidden behind toolboxes, in side coat pockets, under the car seat. The kind of drinking that didn't announce itself. It just grew roots. Claire noticed first. Wives always do. She confronted him gently at first, with concern rather than anger. But concern gave way to frustration. Frustration gave way to fear. Fear eventually gave way to exhaustion. She tried everything. Encouragement, pleading, ultimatums, cold stares, warm reassurances. She took him to rehab twice. She drove him to meetings. She told him she loved him, and she told him she couldn't keep fighting for him alone. But addiction has a gravity all its own. And Edward, who had once been the strong center of their family, became a man who drifted toward his worst impulses. By the time 1983 arrived, their home felt more like a hostage situation than a marriage. On March 15th, Edward stumbled through the door at 2 a.m, smelling of whiskey and regret. He didn't even remember what had sent him drinking that day. Maybe stress, maybe habit, maybe nothing at all. But Claire had reached the end. Her bags were packed. Lily was dressed, sitting silently on the couch, hugging her stuffed horse, so tightly her knuckles were white. "I can't do this anymore," Claire said, her voice steady in a way that broke Edward more than tears would have. "I'm taking Lily. We're leaving." Edward's drunken mind twisted the moment into something desperate and panicked. He grabbed her arm to stop her, not to hurt her, not intentionally, but because he was drowning and she was the last solid thing within reach. They struggled. She lost her balance. The edge of the counter met her skull with a sound Edward would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. She never made it to the hospital alive. The hours that followed were a blur of sirens, statements, shock. Edward sat in the police interrogation room staring at his hands, as though they belonged to someone else. The prosecutor wanted prison time. But the evidence, the circumstances, and Claire's family's complex emotions led to a plea deal. Involuntary manslaughter, 5 years probation, mandatory AA, supervised visitation. But the real punishment came later. Claire's sister won full custody of Lily. She made it clear, "You will never see her again, not as long as I can stop it." And she did stop it, thoroughly. Letters returned unopened, phone calls unanswered, addresses changed repeatedly. Lily disappeared into another state, another life, another future where her father did not exist. Edward's grief became a storm that swept through every corner of his life. He lost his job, his house, his will to wake up in the morning. He slept in his car. He drank until the world blurred. And yet, even at his worst, he never stopped whispering Claire's name to the dark or imagining Lily's face when she'd been small enough to ride on his shoulders. 6 months after Claire's death, Edward drove north. No plan, no destination, just running from a life that had burned down around him. The night was cold. The mountains were a jagged silhouette against a moonless sky. The road turned to dirt, then narrowed, then grew wild. At last, deep in the Wyoming wilderness, his car sputtered and died. He took this as a sign. He had a gun. He had nothing left. The quiet of the mountains felt like permission. He sat in the driver's seat for hours, shaking, crying, unable to lift the gun or put it down. And then, in the silent darkness, he heard something move outside the car. At first, he thought it was the wind shifting the branches, but the sound grew steady, heavy, rhythmic, hoofbeats. A young paint stallion emerged from the trees, his coat bright even under starlight. He approached with confidence that didn't make sense for a wild horse. He sniffed the car, sniffed the air, then pressed his face close to the window, looking directly at the broken man inside. Edward rolled the window down. The horse didn't flinch. Instead, he exhaled warm breath onto Edward's face, as if acknowledging him, as if saying, "I see you." Edward lowered the gun. He didn't speak at first, didn't know how, but the presence of that young stallion, standing silent in the night, created a space inside Edward that grief had hollowed out. For the first time since Claire's death, he felt something other than despair. Not hope, not yet, just stillness. "You don't know what I did," Edward whispered. "You don't know who I am." The horse blinked, calm and unafraid. "You don't care, do you?" The stallion didn't move, didn't judge, didn't abandon him. They stayed like that until dawn. A man with nothing left. A wild creature with no reason to stay. Yet he stayed. When the first light touched the mountains, Edward stepped out of the car, looked at the horse, and felt something click inside him. A promise forming before he even had words for it. "I'll live," he said quietly. "If you come back, I'll live." 2 months later, he returned with lumber, tools, and a plan. He bought the nearby land, built a cabin near the exact spot where the stallion had appeared, and waited. For 3 weeks, nothing. He feared he'd imagined it, feared the animal had moved on. But on the 22nd morning, hoofbeats returned. The young stallion approached slowly, remembering. A connection sparked in the cold morning air. Edward held out an apple. "I'll call you, promise," he said, "because you kept me alive long enough to make one." From that day forward, their lives intertwined in a ritual more consistent than any bond Edward had ever known. And the world would not hear the full truth of that night, or what it created, until decades later. The years that followed that first miraculous meeting didn't unfold like a movie montage. Life in the mountains wasn't romantic or dramatic. It was slow. It was repetitive. It was demanding in the way only wilderness can be, quietly, relentlessly, without negotiation. But Edward accepted that. In fact, the predictable grind of survival suited him. It anchored him. And every morning, at exactly 5:15 a.m., he walked to the same fence line and waited for the one creature who had kept him from ending his life. Promise always came. At first, their meetings were tentative. Edward would offer food through the slats of the fence. Promise would sniff it, decide whether trust was worth the risk, and then accept. Over time, the visits stretched longer. The stallion began lowering his head when he saw Edward, an acknowledgement of familiarity. Edward stopped flinching at the sound of hoofbeats approaching from behind him. Their routine wasn't shaped by training, ownership, or any human dominance. It was shaped by choice. And choice is far deeper than instinct. Weeks became months. Months became years. Winters carved their brutality into the mountains. Summers delivered heat that baked the earth until it cracked. But neither creature broke the pattern. At 5:15, Edward walked. At 5:15, Promise arrived. It didn't matter if the snow hit Edward's knees. Didn't matter if rain lashed sideways across the ridgeline. Didn't matter if wolves howled in the distance or if thunder rolled across the valley. The fence line became the meeting point between two beings who had no reason to trust each other and every reason to continue showing up. Promise grew into a dominant stallion, leading a small wild band to the high country. By the time he was 10, he was unmistakable, a muscular, sharp-eyed paint with a striking pattern and a presence that made other horses move aside. Yet no matter how vast his territory became, no matter how many Mars followed his lead, he honored one ritual above all others. Some mornings Edward watched him descend the slope with wounds, scratches from rival stallions, bites from predators, a limp that suggested he'd stumbled on rock. But he came anyway. Edward would whisper encouragement, stroke his muzzle, talk him to the pain like someone comforting an old friend. When Promise healed, Edward celebrated quietly, grateful beyond words. Edward aged too. The solitude hardened him in some ways. leaner, tougher, quieter, but softened him in others. The mountain air carved deep lines into his face. Years of chopping would thicken his hands. The silence taught him to listen more than talk. But the grief lodged inside him never truly shrank. Instead, it shifted form. The guilt over Claire's death, the ache of losing Lily, the constant feeling that he didn't deserve a second chance. They all lived inside him like ghosts that refused to leave. Promise was the only one he let in. Edward talked to him the way some men talk to God, not expecting answers, not expecting forgiveness, just needing a witness. "I miss her," he'd say quietly. "Both of them. Some days the guilt feels heavier than the mountains. You're the only thing that keeps me looking forward instead of backward." Promise listened. Maybe he didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone, the weight, the sorrow. Animals often do, far better than humans. The decades stacked on top of each other like firewood. By the time the 90s rolled in, people in Pine Ridge had stopped imagining Edward would ever return. By the early 2000s, tourists asked about the mountain hermit out of novelty. Some locals swore he'd gone feral. Others claimed he was long dead, and his ghost was haunting the peaks. The sheriff once volunteered a welfare check, but Ward the cashier waved him off. "He comes down for supplies every few months," Ward said. "Not a threat, not our business." And Edward preferred it that way. The less people knew, the safer the world was from him. That's how he saw it. He'd forfeited his right to family, community, normal life. But he could keep one promise, to show up for the creature who saved him. The bond endured what ordinary relationships couldn't. There was a winter in '98 when a storm dumped 6 feet of snow in 3 days. The mountains froze under a brutal cold that killed cattle and snapped old trunks in half. Edward made the walk anyway, leaning into the wind hard enough to feel his spine shake. He arrived at the fence, certain Promise wouldn't come. But he did. The stallion emerged through whiteout conditions like a ghost carved from snow, trembling but standing tall. He pushed his head against Edward's chest for warmth, and Edward wrapped his arms around his neck, feeling the animal's heartbeat thudding against his coat. That morning became a legend neither of them would ever forget. There was the summer of 2006, when Edward found Promise bleeding from a deep cut along his hind leg, likely from a barbed wire tangle. Edward cleaned the wound with shaking hands, whispering apologies for every sting of antiseptic. Promise didn't kick, didn't shy away. He trusted Edward in a way no one else ever had. By 2015, both were aging. Edward was 66, Promise around 34, ancient for a wild stallion. Their movements grew slower, their mornings quieter. Sometimes Promise would arrive and simply stand beside Edward without taking food, as if comfort mattered more than routine. Edward's knees ached so fiercely, he often had to brace himself on the fence just to stay standing. One morning, Edward chuckled weakly and said, "Look at us, 2 stubborn old fools trying to outlast the world." Promise nudged his shoulder gently, the touch feather-light, but age wasn't the only thing closing in. In early 2023, during one of his rare trips to town, Edward collapsed outside the clinic. Tests revealed what he'd feared ever since the pain in his stomach had begun its quiet assault months earlier: pancreatic cancer, stage terminal. 6 months, maybe less. Edward didn't argue, didn't panic, didn't ask for treatment. He simply nodded, thanked the doctor, and walked out. The drive back to his cabin felt different. The mountains looked sharper somehow, as if they knew time had begun counting down. The next morning, when Promise arrived, Edward placed a trembling hand on his muzzle. "I'm dying," he whispered, "and I don't know what happens to you after I'm gone." Promise breathed against his cheek, slow and steady. "I don't want to leave you," Edward said, tears falling freely now. "But I don't get to choose this one." The stallion closed his eyes, resting his forehead against Edward's. And something in that moment broke open inside the old man. 40 years of guilt, pain, loneliness, and unspoken gratitude poured out in silence. From that day forward, every meeting carried a gravity neither of them ignored. By June, Edward could barely walk, but he made the journey anyway, taking nearly half an hour to cross a distance he once walked in minutes. Promise always waited, motionless until he arrived. "You're the only friend I've ever had who never left," Edward rasped one morning. Promise flicked an ear, as if hearing him perfectly. By August, the pain was unbearable. But Edward refused to die without honoring the ritual one last time. On the morning of August 27th, he walked slower than he ever had, leaning on his stick so hard it nearly snapped. He reached the fence, saw Promise waiting, and whispered, "We made it." One last morning. Promise approached, eyes full of something that looked painfully close to understanding. Edward fed him the last apple he owned. Then he pressed his forehead to the stallion's one final time. "Thank you for saving my life," he whispered. "Thank you for staying." Promise watched him walk away. Edward returned to his cabin, lay on his bed, and never got up again. But the ritual did not die with him. Promise returned to the fence the next morning, and the next, and the next, for 6 months. The world was about to discover a truth far more powerful than solitude, that loyalty can outlive the very person it clings to. When Edward Callahan took his final breath inside that quiet cabin, the world didn't shift. The mountains didn't tremble. The wind didn't pause. His passing didn't send ripples through any community, because he hadn't belonged to one for 40 years. There was no funeral procession, no grieving family outside a chapel, no obituary in a newspaper. But high in the Wyoming backcountry, a wild paint stallion felt the absence instantly. Promise arrived the next morning at 5:15 a.m., stepping to the thin mist, expecting to see the silhouette he had known for 4 decades. The fence was empty. The air was still. The mountains were the same, but something fundamental had changed. Promise waited anyway. He didn't graze, didn't wander, didn't call out. He simply stood, ears angled toward the cabin, as if listening for footsteps he could no longer hear. After nearly 2 hours, he finally turned and made the long walk back to the high country. The next morning, he returned. And the morning after that, and the morning after that. 6 months passed this way. 6 months of loyalty to a man who would never return. The sheriff, the townspeople, the county, they all assumed Edward had simply died of age and isolation. When Sheriff Mike Rodriguez found the envelope on Edward's table containing his will, he skimmed past the line requesting that someone check on the paint stallion who visits the northeast fence every morning. Mike shook his head and dismissed it as the ramblings of a lonely, confused old man. Horses didn't behave that way, he told himself. So no one checked. No one knew. Until February 28, 2024. A wildlife photographer named Elena Vasquez was tracking the movement of wild horses for a conservation project. Promise's band had fascinated her for weeks. But one detail didn't fit. Their lead stallion disappeared every morning at the exact same time for several hours with precision she had never observed in the wild. At dawn, she followed him. Promise moved with an unmistakable sense of purpose, down narrow game trails, across a frozen creek, along ridges worn smooth by decades of hooves. Elena kept her distance, breath catching when she realized where he was heading. The old Callahan property. The hermit's place. Promise walked directly to the northeast fence line, stood in the exact spot he always had, and waited. The stallion's stillness was almost reverent. Elena raised her camera, capturing frame after frame, heart pounding as she realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. An animal remembering, an animal grieving, an animal honoring a bond no one else had seen. Promise waited for hours. When he finally walked away, Elena drove back to town faster than she ever had. She burst into the county clerk's office, demanding access to Edward's file. The clerk, skeptical but curious, showed her the will, showed her the ignored note. Elena whispered, this wasn't dementia, this was devotion. Within 2 weeks, her documentation reached the local news. That small-town broadcast exploded into a national story, then an international one. Wild stallion waits every morning for hermit who died 6 months ago. 40-year bond between man and wild horse discovered in Wyoming. Wildlife experts debated. Ethicists weighed in. Viewers around the world cried in front of their screens. But the story reached somewhere even more unexpected. California. A woman named Margaret Flynn recognized the name immediately. Edward Callahan, her brother-in-law, Claire's husband, Lily's father. She called the sheriff. She told him everything Pine Ridge had never known: the accident, the custody battle, the disappearance. The daughter who had grown up believing her father had abandoned her, only to discover he had spent 40 years torturing himself with guilt and silence. When Lily heard the truth, she broke. A lifetime of anger dissolved into grief, so crushing that she drove to Pine Ridge the next morning, arriving just before dawn. Sheriff Rodriguez guided her to property, her hand shaking as she approached the fence line. Promise was already there, waiting. When Lily stepped toward the fence, Promise lifted his head. His ears flicked forward. Something like recognition passed between them. Not of her face, but a grief she carried, grief shaped like the man he had loved. "I'm Lily," she whispered, "Edward's daughter." Promise stepped closer. Gently, carefully. Her breath trembled. She removed a folded piece of paper from her pocket. A letter she had written years ago but never mailed. A letter of forgiveness. A letter her father never received. She read it aloud at the fence line, voice breaking. When she finished, Promise pressed his muzzle to the exact spot where her hand rested, and Lily understood her father had not been alone, not for one day in 40 years. This horse had been his family when she couldn't be. "Thank you," she whispered, "for staying with him, for saving him." In the weeks that followed, Lily made a decision. She bought Edward's land from the state and created the Promise Foundation, dedicated to protecting the wild herds of Wyoming, preserving their habitats, and ensuring that Promise's lineage could roam free. She kept the fence line exactly as it had been. No repairs, no upgrades, no modernization, just as Edward and Promise had known it. She funded a small trust ensuring that someone would stand at that fence every morning at 5:15, honoring the ritual that had sustained two lonely souls for decades. Promise kept coming. Not every day now. Age was catching him. His once powerful stride softened. His coat faded to gray around the muzzle. But even in his 40s, astonishingly old for a wild stallion, he made the journey when he could. Lily visited often. She talked to him. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she simply sat, letting the silence say what words could not. In June 2026, Promise passed away peacefully in his sleep. His band gathered around in what wildlife biologists later described as unprecedented, a 3-day vigil from his herd. His life had been long, his loyalty unmatched. Lily buried him beside Edward's cabin, beneath a tall pine that overlooked the valley. The headstone read, "Promise, 1981 to 2026. He kept faith for 40 years. At the dedication, Lily spoke through tears. "My father was a broken man who believed he didn't deserve love. Promise proved him wrong every morning for 40 years. This stallion didn't care about his past. He cared that he showed up. That is what love is. Presence, consistency, faithfulness without condition." The Promise Foundation flourished. It protected over 200,000 acres. It rehabilitated injured wild horses. It taught thousands of people the story of a man who punished himself with silence and the stallion who refused to let him disappear. Every year, on August 27th, people from around the world gathered at Edward's fence line at 5:15 a.m. They came to honor two beings who saved each other. They came to feel that cold morning air where grief and loyalty still lingered. Some swore they could hear hoofbeats echoing from the ridge. Some claimed Promise's descendants visited the fence at dawn. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was something deeper. And somewhere, quiet as a breath, the world understood this. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't between people. Sometimes they aren't romantic. Sometimes they don't even speak the same language. Sometimes love is just presence, showing up every morning for 40 years.